Hi all, welcome to CyberWarFare AWS Cloud Red Team course. In this module, we will discuss about what are the services provided by AWS, how we can use those services, and how we can exploit those services if there are any misconfiguration present in those services. So this is how we can perform the red teaming in AWS infrastructure. So first we'll discuss about identity and access management. So we'll talk about each and every services, but first let's discuss about identity and access management. So we divided these services in three sections. One is the introduction about the service, second one is the component, and third one is the exploitations. In introduction, we'll discuss about what is services useful, what are the components, entities there in the services, and how we can exploit, what are the way we can exploit these services, and what are the way we can misuse the services to gain any persistence, initial access, enumerations, privilege escalation, or how we can perform a red team life cycle in exploiting those services. So let's discuss one by one. So the first thing is IAM. So basically AWS Identity and Access Management enable you to manage access to AWS services and resource securely. So basically it allows you to access to assign access in a secure manners. IAM allow you to create and manage AWS users and groups and use permissions to allow and deny their access to AWS resources. So basically you can assign the permissions to users, groups, and roles in AWS environment so they can access or deny those AWS resources. AWS IAM allows, these are the three things mainly done by IAM. The first thing is manage users, groups, and their access, manage roles and their permissions, and third one is manage federated users and their permissions. So basically federated users is the users where suppose you have or an organization have external identity providers, just like they have on-prem Active Directory, so they can use the same identity, same credentials to access the AWS resources. So how you can manage access to those users using AWS IAM. So these are the basic functionalities provided by AWS IAM. Now let's discuss each and everything one by one. So you can see here the overview is we have IAM. Under the IAM, these are the three things. One is users, second one is groups, and third one is roles. You can see here each of these services, there is one policy which is attached to these services. What is there in policy? So policy basically contains the permissions. So you can attach the policies to a users, you can attach the policies to a group, and you can attach the policy to a role. So those users, group, and roles can access AWS services. What is defined by the policies, what permissions they have, so they can access the AWS services or resources. So now discuss about the basic component of IAM have. The first thing, they have the users. So users is basically AWS Identity and Access Management. Users is an entity that you create in AWS to represent the person or application that use it to interact with AWS. So basically, users is an identity which is used to access AWS services. Second one is users consist of a name and a credential. So if you create a users, you need a username as well as the credentials to access the AWS services. How we can access the AWS services? This is defined by AWS IAM. So you can access through programmatically or AWS Management Consoles. So programmatically means you need a access key ID and secret access key, and you can configure your AWS CLI, APK, SDK, APIs to access those services using any programmatic you have or any programming language you want to define it. Second thing, you can access AWS services, or user can access AWS services using management console when they have a username as well as password. So this is how you can access AWS services. Let's discuss in practically manners how we can access it, how we can create the user, how we can assign the permissions to the users. Okay, so this is a portal of IAM. So this is the portal of IAM. This is called Management Console of AWS, and you can see here, if I visit here in IAM Identity and Access Management, by default IAM have a users which is called root users. Basically, root users is created when you subscribe for AWS services. So this is a default user which is a super admin, which is used to perform administrative tasks as well as billing. After that, you can create as many users as you want. So you can see here in left hand side, and just click on the users. So these are the users, but there is no root user is mentioned here. So these are the users. Apart from these, there is one root user. So I need a root user credential to access this console. You can also define another users to access through programmatically or management console. So you can see here, suppose if I click on the admin user, this is the ARN. ARN is a unique identity of each and every resource in AWS environment. So you can see here how this ARN can be divided. So we have ARN first, then AWS, then services. So currently I'm using IAM services. This is 12-digit customer ID or your account number. This is the 12-digit. Each and every account have this 12-digit unique ID. And this is the resource. I'm talking about users, and this is the username which is you can specify here. So this is how ARN can be divided and can be uniquely identify what services, what resource, in what account I'm going to access it. You can see here in this page, these are the sub tabs. So you can see here the permission tab, what permissions or what policies I attach to this user. So I attached the administrator access policy to this users. That means this user can also perform an administrator access, or can also have administrator access and can perform all administrative tasks in AWS services or resources. How we can access this AWS services? So you can see here in the security credential tab. In this tab, you can see here I can access through either console, because console single sign-in link is there. So this is the single sign-in link. If you want to access through a root user, you can directly log into console.aws.amazon.com. But if you want to access through a IAM user, this is a single sign-on link. So you have to specify here your AWS account ID, 12-digit account ID, and it will be this will be the same. So you can access through any users. So the console is already enabled here, and you can see here there is 2 access key which is assigned to this admin user. So you can access through console as well as programmatically. In programmatically, you need access key ID as well as password, but in console, for programmatically access, you need a access key ID as well as secrets. But if you want to access through console, you need a username as well as password. So this is how it's look like for the users. You can see here in another users, these are the permission which is attached to this user. This is a group where the user part of, and how we can access it. So management console by default disabled for this user. So this user can only access the AWS services using programmatically. That means they can access through API, CLI, SDK. They need access key ID as well as secret to access the AWS resources or services. So this is how a user is look like. Now let's discuss about another entity of AWS. Second one, we are going to discuss about a groups. So what is a groups? So basically IAM groups is a collection of IAM users, and group let you specify permissions for multiple users, which can make it easier to manage the permissions for those users. So basically group contain a set of users, and you can assign the permission directly to the group, so those permission will be applicable to the user also. Suppose if there is an organization, we have a developer and we have a tester. So we can create a group for a developer. We can assign the permissions or policy attached to this group. So that means all the developer have same rights which is assigned to this group. So that will help you to reduce the the manageability of the policies. So you, instead of assign the policy to each and every developer, you can create a group. You can directly assign to policies to this group. Same like if you are a tester, you can attach the policies which is applicable for the tester. So that means it will reduce the effort and it will be easy for managing the policy or permissions. So what is the characteristic of a group have? Just like a group can contain many users, and a users can be belongs to a multiple group. So suppose in a group we can have multiple users, as many as users as we want, and a users can be a part of multiple groups. So suppose there is employee which can be a part of employee group as well as part of a developer group. So this is how we can segregate groups. Second thing, group can't be nested. They can only contain the users. So that means in a group can only contain users but not the groups. So this is the restriction have in AWS. Let's see how in practical manners it's look like. So I'm just going again in my AWS console. You can see here in the left hand side we have a group options. Currently I have only single group. You can create as many group as you want, and this group we have only 2 users. So you can see here I have only 2 users. In IAM I have 3 users, but in this group I have 2 users. So you can add another user, you can remove the user from this group, and you can directly attach the permissions. So whatever permission you attach in this group will be applied on each and every user which is part of this group. So suppose there is a non-priv users. So non-priv user can be a part of this group or simultaneously can be part of another group. So this is how a group should look like. And this is the ARN of group to uniquely identify each and every groups or resource in AWS environment. So this is how groups is look like, and this is how it is really important. And it is also important when you're performing your red teaming that you found that some users which is a part of any higher privilege group, so you can escalate your privilege and you can do any more critical tasks which is not there in your current roles. So let's discuss all these things one by one in our upcoming session. Okay, so now we are going to discuss about roles. What is a role? So basically a role is a IAM entity that define a set of permission for making AWS service request. Suppose I discuss about user, I discuss about group. There may be AWS services just like EC2 or S3 or RDS or the services which is there in AWS environment. Suppose if one service wants to access to another resource or another service in AWS environment, how they can access it, what permissions they have, it can be defined by roles. So basically role is we can attach the permissions to a role, and role can be attached to particular services. So suppose there is a simple scenario. There is one application which is running there in EC2. This application wants to access S3. So suppose it's uploading few files on S3 buckets, this application. How we can assign this permissions to this EC2? So to assign this permission, we create one role. In this role, we define that this role can access or can have a full permission on this S3 or all the S3 buckets. So when you attach this role to a specific EC2, this EC2 can access S3, and this is done by only role. So let's see here. So in this diagram, you can see here, so we have IAM. This is the identity and access management. The first thing what we did, we create a role for EC2 service. This is really important. What a service for you creating a role. So we created a role for EC2 service. What is contained this role? This role contains full permissions to S3. So this role have a full permission to S3. So we created a role, that's it. Now we have to, after creating the role, we have to attach this role to a specific instance. So suppose we created a role for EC2 services. Initially, this EC2 doesn't have any permissions on this S3 if we are not attaching this role to this one. After we attach the role to this EC2 instance, this EC2 instance have a full permissions to S3. So this is how we can create a role, we can assign the permissions to this role, and after that we can attach this role to a specific requirement or a specific resources. So resource can access another resources in AWS environment. So let's see how role is look like in a practical manner. So you can see here in IAM dashboard, when you click on the roles, you can see here all the roles. You can create a new roles, and all the role will be listed here. The most important thing is trusted entity. Trusted entities means for which this role is created for. So suppose you can see here we have AWS services, and there is one account. So this role can be created for services as well as users. So when you can see here account, this means this role is created for a users which is a part of same account or maybe a part of another AWS account. So this role is created for Lambda services. This role is created for EC2 services. So you can see here, this is the policy attached to this role. This is the ARN of this role, and trust relationship, you can see here it is for EC2. So you can attach this role to EC2, then only EC2 have a full permission on S3, can access all this in S3 bucket. So this is how role is look like. So suppose if for better understanding, suppose if I'm creating a role, you can see here these are the 4 trusted entity. For them you can create the role. One is services, which is part of same AWS account. All the services will be listed here. Another AWS account, you can creating something for another AWS account. You can creating, or you can you can create the role for this trusted entity that will web. You can specify just like Google, Amazon, Facebook, and you can also create for SML service provider if you are using your on Active Directory. So this is how you can create the role. So suppose I created a role for EC2. This means the trusted entity will be EC2. I can only attach this role to EC2. What permissions I can set? So you can set whatever permission you want. So it will create this role. After creating this role, you have to attach this role to specific EC2, the EC2 which you want a full access on S3. So this is how we can define the roles. How the role is important, how we can exploit the role, what is permissions there in this role will be discussed on later section. Okay, so let's move to the fourth point, discuss about this fourth point, policies. So we discuss about users, we discuss about group, we discuss about roles, and we discuss about we have to attach the permissions. The permission can be attached in format of policies. Policy contains a set of rules, what resources they want to access it, what permission, what action they can perform, and if it's allow or deny. So you can see here IAM policy define permissions for an actions to perform the operations. So basically there is one user, so you can attach the policy that this user can perform uh, get user actions. That means this user can list it down all the users through Amazon console, CLI or API, or this user have a read-only access on AWS resources. So this is how you can create the policy, create the permissions, create the policy, and attach the policy or permission to user groups or roles. What data contain these policies? So there are three entities we can define in this policy. The first one is effect. Effect means if it's allow or deny access. Maybe this policy deny the access or maybe allow this access. Actions, what actions you can perform or what actions you have. So you can see here you can have a get actions, put action, delete action, all the CARD operations you can do here. So it's defined by the permissions or policies. And third one is a resource, where you want to perform these operations or these actions. So suppose I created one role, I assigned the policy that this role can access the S3 bucket. So in this case, effect will be allow, action will be full, means get, put, delete, or you can say star, and resource will be S3 bucket. So this is how we can create the policy. After creating this policy, policy can be attached to a users, policy can be attached to a group, or policy can be attached to a role. So there are two types of policies you can discuss here. This is the policies, and we have an inline policy as well as managed policy. Managed policy is further divided into AWS Managed Policy or customer managed policy. Let's discuss this thing in our practical demonstrations. You can see here from going back, I'm clicking on this policy tab, you can see here all the policy will be listed here. These are the policy which is there in AWS. So I can filter out. I'm just only looking the AWS managed policy. So in AWS managed policy, we will discuss about managed policy. What is managed policy? What is inline policy? And what is the difference? So when you're talking about managed policy is divided into AWS managed policy or customer managed policy. So basically, what is managed policy? So managed policy have a physical existence, means you have to create a policy, you have to assign the permission, and it also have one unique ARN. So suppose we have, suppose this is the policy we have. When you click on this policy, this is AWS managed policy. So all the permission which is by default set by AWS. So this is a default permission. That's why it's called AWS managed policy. And this policy have this URN, physical URN. You can attach these policies to user group or multiple users, multiple group, multiple roles at a time. So that's why this is called a managed policy, because it have a physical existence and you can attach this policy to users group or roles. So this is the URN of this policy here. Now, this is why we can say it's a managed AWS managed policy. Why? Because all the permission is defined default by AWS. Then what is customer managed policy? So I'm just filtering it out, remove this one and see. This is a customer managed policy. So I created a policy, I defined the permission according to my need, because I don't want few users to access this one or few operations. So I created the permission according to I need. So you can see here I created one policy where allow operations can be, what action he can only perform the list user actions, and what resources. So you can see it's user's resources to perform these actions. So I created this policy, or maybe organization created this policy, the customer managed policy, so customer can change it. And so that's why it's really important, because for a red team perspective, because we have to understand, or we have to look for a customer managed policy, because there may be a lot more chance to misconfigure this policy, or giving the access privileged to any users group or role. So we have to check very careful about customer managed policy. So we discuss about managed policy, AWS managed policy, as well as customer managed policy. But what about inline policies? So when you go for a users, you can see here this admin user. You can see here the policy, which is this is a AWS managed policy. All that permission is defined by the AWS, and we attached this policy to these users, admin users. When you click, you can view. You can see here it will define about the permissions the ARN of this policy have. So you can see here this is the permission, this is the ARN, and in policy users you can see here where is this policy is attached. So simultaneously it can be attached. It is attached to admin. This is the users, and it is attached to a EC2 assume role. This is the role. So this is how you can define the policy. Now let's move to the another user, non-priv user. This is also have two policy. One policy we are directly attached to this user, and second policy we attach to a group, and which is also applicable for these users. Let's move to the third one. Okay, in this case you can see here we have three policies. One is managed policy, which is directly attached to this user. Second one is inline policy. So what is the difference between managed policy and inline policy? If you click on the managed policy, you can see here managed policy have the same permissions, users, and all these things, as well as the policy ARN. That means it physically exists here, and we can attach this managed policy to users group or role. But what about inline policy? It doesn't have any physical existence. So when you expand this one, you can see here all the permission which is assigned to this one, but you don't have a similar like managed policy, the policy users, policy version. You don't have a policy users where this policy is attached, because inline policy can be embedded at a time to a user. So one user can have one inline policy, or maybe it's have a multiple inline policies according to what policy you assign, but one policy. So this policy can be assigned at a time. So you can see here this is the inline policy, and which is embedded here. So second difference is we can attach the managed policy to a user group or a role, but inline policy can't be attached. Inline policy can be embedded to a user's group or role, which doesn't have any physical existence. Means just like just like managed policy we have ARN, same like inline policy doesn't have any ARN. So you can directly embed it to a user's group or role, this inline policies. So this is the difference between managed policy and inline policy. And there's one more difference. Suppose you created one policy and you attached to multiple users, and you created a policy as a customer managed policy, and you attached to different users. If you change the policy in one place, all the users which is attached this policy is affected. But other case in inline policy, it's embedded directly to users. So that means you have to change the policy each and every users to take it more effective. Or what effect you have to change? You have to change the inline policy for each and every user. So this is the main difference between inline policy and customer or managed policy. think it's done. Now, fifth one is security token services. So basically, STS is a basically web services which will assign you a temporary credentials, which is a limited privilege credentials for a users. For a users that you authenticate means a federated users. So basically, STS allow you to assign a temporary credentials for a short period of time. What this credential does contains, it contains access key ID, secret access key, and security token. So when you're talking about temporary credentials, let's discuss. So there are two types of temporary credentials. One is STS and second one is AWS metadata. When you're talking about STS, can only be applicable for a users or other AWS account user or services. But when we're talking about AWS metadata, it will only applicable for the roles within the same AWS accounts. So suppose there is one user who doesn't have a privilege who this user can get a temporary credential if they have a STS assume role permission set to it. Second one is even when we have a IAM roles, when we have a roles and roles want to access the some resources, so they need a temporary credentials. So they can request on this endpoint and they can get the temporary credentials. So use those credentials, they can access the other resources or the privilege which is assigned to this temporary credentials. But in STS, user have to hit this endpoint to get the temporary credential. So temporary STS credential is assigned to a users, or AWS metadata credential is assigned to a roles. Both have a temporary credentials. So let's discuss about very simple example. It's really important. There is one scenario called assume role. As in this diagram, you can see here we have a development AWS account, we have a production AWS account. In production AWS account, which is used for a production purpose. So suppose there is a case where a users in developer account, maybe a DevOps user, want to change something in production account. But this user doesn't have any rights on these resources on production account. How we can assign the rights? The first method is we can create a users here in production account. We can give the credentials to these users, but this will be really risky because those credentials will be never expire and it's very difficult to manage all these things. So second thing is called assume role. So in assume role, suppose we created a role in production account. This role have a full access or the restricted access or the access which you need on these resources in the production account. And other hand, in this user, this is a user which have a STS permissions set to it. STS assume role permissions. That means this user can assume any roles. But so first prerequisite is this user should have this STS assume role permission. And second prerequisite is have this role, in this role, trusted entity. So the ARN of this user, ARN of you can see developer account user should have in their trusted entity. After that, this user can assume this role and whatever rights, whatever privilege this role have on this services is applicable for this user. So this user also get the same privilege once this have this assume role, as well as in this privilege this have this the trusted entities. This user ARN should be there. So once you have two requirements, you can this user can request for a temporary credentials for this role, because first thing is I already have this permissions to assume this role, and second one is here in this role this user have as a trusted user. So that means this user can request for privilege, temporary credential. Once these two criteria are checked, this role assign temporary credentials to this user, and once this user got the temporary credential, they can access the AWS resources. They can access the AWS resources with the same privilege which is assigned to this privilege role. This is how it's called assume role. So these users assume the roles to this privilege roles and can access the resources for a short period of time, so they can perform any updation, any deletions on the production environment. After 10 minutes, I think it's expired within the 10 minutes, this user lost the privileged. So again, here to authenticate again, here to get the credential again, to perform the action again. So this is how it is really important. So in this case, unprivileged user access AWS resources with assume role. So this is how they got the credential. They got the credentials using this STS endpoint. So they hit the endpoint, STS check those two criteria. Once those two criteria is met, they can assign the temporary credential and user can access the resources. So this is all about how we can use the STS to get the temporary credential and how we can do this thing. So this is all about the services. We can't say services, but all entity, all the usability of IAM, identity and access management. Now we will discuss about how you can enumerate as an authenticated user to all the services, how you can perform a different privilege escalation or different exploitation if there is a misconfigured there in those services. So we'll discuss the exploitation part in our next section. Okay, so thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you.